Welcome to Blind History with Josh Barry. Today we will be discussing part 2 of the history of the first known organized band of outlaws in the United States, the Cowboys. Let's dive in. The Boiling Point, Escalation of Hostilities. By the spring of 1881, the ideological lines in Cochise County had been drawn, and the primary actors were heavily armed and mutually deeply suspicious. The friction between the agrarian, red-sashed cowboys and the urban, badge-wearing Earp faction was no longer confined to saloon arguments and political maneuvering. Over the course of a few brutal months, a series of violent catalysts, robberies, massacres, and a disastrous secret alliance would propel Tombstone past the point of no return. Blood in the canyons, the Smuggler massacres. While the Cowboys' tension with the Earps was mounting in town, their operations along the border were becoming increasingly brazen and bloody. In July 1881, a particularly ruthless faction of cowboys, rumored to include Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo, ambushed a heavily armed Mexican smuggling train in Skeleton Canyon. The smugglers were transporting adobe bricks that, unbeknownst to casual observers, were hollowed out and filled with smuggled Mexican silver. The cowboys slaughtered the smugglers, stealing the silver and the livestock. This was not simple rustling. It was a massacre that threatened to ignite an international incident between the United States and Mexico. The violence quickly ricocheted. Just weeks later, in August, old Man Clanton and a crew of his rustlers were ambushed while sleeping in Guadalupe Canyon. The attackers were lovely Mexican rural police or rival smugglers, exacting vengeance for the Skeleton Canyon massacre. Old Man Clanton and several others were killed, stripping the cowboy syndicate of its patriarch. This violent destabilization on the border made the younger, more volatile cowboys, particularly Ike Clanton and Curly Bill, increasingly paranoid, aggressive, and prone to lashing out at any perceived threats, especially federal lawmen like the Earps. The Benson stage robbery and the War of Narratives. The true turning point in the local feud occurred on the evening of March 15, 1881, when masked men attempted to rob the Kinnear and Company stagecoach traveling from Tombstone to Benson. The robbers, armed with rifles, stepped into the road and ordered the coach to halt. Instead of stopping, the shotgun messenger, Bob Paul, fired at the outlaws. In the ensuing chaotic gunfight, the stage driver, Eli Budd, Philpott, and a passenger named Peter Roerig were shot and killed. The brutal murder of a popular stage driver sent shockwaves through Tombstone's Investa class. A posse was immediately formed, which included Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, as well as Doc Holliday and Sheriff Johnny Behan. However, the pursuit quickly dissolved into bitter factionalism. A war of narratives began. The Cowboys, aided by Sheriff Behan, attempted to frame Doc Holliday for the robbery, exploiting his friendship with the Earps to tarnish the rival lawman's reputation. They even manipulated Holliday's on-again, off-again companion, Big Nose, Kate Elder, into signing an affidavit implicating him, which she later recanted once she sobered up. In return, the Earps correctly identified the robbers as known cowboys: Bill Leonard, Harry Head, and Jim Crane. The Earps accused Behan of intentionally throwing the posse off the trail to protect his rural constituents. From this point forward, the Earps and the Cowboys viewed each other not just as rivals, but as mortal enemies actively trying to destroy one another legally and physically. The stolen U.S. Army mules. The Earps' frustration with the Cowboys' impunity boiled over during the summer of 1881, involving the theft of U.S. Army mules. The mules were stolen from Camp Rucker, and the commander requested the assistance of Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp to recover them. Virgil, accompanied by his brothers, tracked the mules directly to the McClory Ranch in the Sulphur Springs Valley. In a brazen display of the cowboys' forging skills, the Earps found the animals with their U.S. brands freshly and clumsily altered to read D8. A tense, heavily armed standoff ensued between the Earps and the cowboys present at the ranch. Seeking to avoid a bloodbath, a compromise was brokered. The Earps would leave, and the cowboys promised to return the mules to the army the next day. The Earps returned to Tombstone, but the mules never arrived. The cowboys had reneged on the deal, mocking the Earps' authority. To men as prideful as Virgil and Wyatt Earp, being publicly humiliated and lied to by cattle rustlers was an unforgivable offense that cemented their belief that diplomacy with the syndicate was useless. A Faustian bargain, Wyatt Earp and Ike Clanton. The final fatal ingredient in this boiling pot was a secret, disastrous pact made between Wyatt Earp and Ike Clanton. Wyatt was consumed by his ambition to become the sheriff of Cochise County, a position he believed he would easily win if he could capture the stage robbers responsible for the Philpott murder. To do this, he needed an informant inside the cowboy syndicate. He approached Ike Clanton with a Faustian bargain. If Ike would lure the three wanted cowboys, Leonard, Head, and Crane, to a specific location, Wyatt would arrest or kill them. In exchange, Wyatt would get the glory needed to win the sheriff's election, and Ike would receive the massive $6,000 Wells Fargo reward money. No questions asked. Ike, motivated by greed, agreed. However, the plan fell apart before it could be executed. Over the summer, all three of the wanted cowboys were killed in separate, unrelated gunfights across the territory and in New Mexico. With the targets dead, the deal was off. But for Ike Clanton, a new terrifying reality set in. If the other cowboys, especially hardened killers like Curly Bill or Johnny Ringo, ever found out that Ike had agreed to sell out his own brothers in arms to Wyatt Earp, they would kill him without hesitation. Ike became obsessed with the fear that Wyatt or Doc Holliday would leak the secret of their aborted deal. This mounting, alcohol-fueled paranoia drove Ike to a state of near madness by late October 1881. It was this fear of being exposed as a traitor to the syndicate that caused Ike to spend the night of October 25th wandering the saloons of Tombstone, heavily armed and drunkenly boasting that he was going to murder the Earps and Doc Holliday by morning. The trap had been set. The border was bleeding. The stage lines were under siege. Federal authority had been mocked, and a paranoid cowboy was threatening the most dangerous men in Tombstone. The ideological war was over. The shooting was about to begin. 30 seconds of history. The gunfight at the OK Corral. The events of October 26, 1881, have been depicted on film more times than almost any other incident in American history. These depictions often feature a slow, dramatic walk down a wide, dusty street, culminating in a stylized duel of fast draws. The historical reality was entirely different. It was a chaotic, confusing, and brutally intimate firefight born of paranoia, sleep deprivation, and a disastrous breakdown in communication. It was not a duel. It was a close-quarters tactical nightmare. The immediate build-up, a morning of pistol whips. The day began in a state of high anxiety. A cold front had moved into Tombstone, bringing freezing winds and snow flurries. Ike Clanton, having stayed up all night drinking and nursing his fear that Wyatt Earp would expose their secret deal, was armed with a Winchester rifle and a six-shooter, publicly threatening to kill the Earps and Doc Holliday on sight. The Earps, operating under city ordinances, moved swiftly to neutralize the threat. Town Police Chief Virgil Earp surprised Ike from behind, pistol-whipping him with his revolver, disarming him and dragging him to court for a fine. Shortly after, a furious Wyatt Earp encountered Tom McClory.
When Tom refused to open his coat to prove he was unarmed, Wyatt brutally buffaloed, pistol-whipped him as well, leaving the rancher bleeding in the street.
The physical humiliation of Ike Clanton and Tom McClory served as a rallying cry for the cowboy faction.
By mid-afternoon, 5 cowboys had gathered in a narrow vacant lot on Fremont Street, wedged between C.S. Fly's boarding house and the Harwood house.
The group consisted of Ike Clanton, his 19-year-old brother Billy, Tom and Frank McClory, and another cowboy named Billy Claiborne. They were armed, angry, and technically in violation of the town's gun ordinance.
Virgil Earp made the fateful decision to disarm them. Because he was short on regular deputies, he deputized his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, his lethal friend, Doc Holliday. As they began their march down Fremont Street, Virgil handed Holliday a short double-barreled shotgun to conceal under his long overcoat, taking Holliday's walking stick in return to appear less aggressive. Before the Earps reached the lot, they were intercepted by Sheriff Johnny Behan. Behan frantically told Virgil, "For God's sake, don't go down there or they will murder you." He then claimed he had already disarmed the cowboys. Virgil, believing the threat was neutralized, put his revolver away. However, Behan had lied, or at least vastly exaggerated. While he had asked the cowboys to give up their guns, Frank McClory and Billy Clanton had outright refused. A tactical breakdown, 6 feet of separation. When the Earp faction turned into the vacant lot, they were not facing men across a wide street. The lot was incredibly narrow, only about 15 to 20 feet wide. The two factions were standing no more than 6 to 10 feet apart. The sheer proximity made the ensuing violence utterly devastating. Virgil Earp stepped forward, holding Doc's walking cane, and commanded, "Throw up your hands! I have come to disarm you." What happened next remains a point of intense historical debate, but the physical evidence and most reliable eyewitness testimony suggest a fatal misinterpretation. As Virgil spoke, Doc Holliday cocked his shotgun, and Wyatt Earp drew his revolver. Seeing the Earps draw, Frank McClory and Billy Clanton laid their hands on their own 6-shooters. Realizing the situation was instantly spiraling out of control, Virgil desperately yelled, "Hold! I don't mean that!" It was too late. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Wyatt Earp, operating on cold tactical logic, recognized that the highly skilled Frank McClory was the greatest threat and fired his first shot into Frank's stomach. Simultaneously, Billy Clanton drew and fired at Wyatt, but his shot went wide. Chaos erupted in the narrow space. The war of black powder filled the air, creating a thick, blinding cloud of smoke. Doc Holliday stepped around a horse and unleashed a point-blank shotgun blast into the right side of Tom McClory's chest, practically tearing the man apart. Tom was likely unarmed, though the Earps maintained he was reaching for a rifle scabbard on a horse. Despite being mortally wounded, Frank McClory and Billy Clanton continued to fight with terrifying resolve. Billy, shot through the chest and wrist, switched his revolver to his left hand and kept firing from a sitting position in the dirt. Frank stumbled out into Fremont Street, where he was caught in a crossfire between Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday, receiving a fatal bullet to the base of his skull. In the midst of the carnage, the man who had started it all, Ike Clanton, panicked. He rushed forward, grabbed Wyatt Earp's arm, and screamed that he was unarmed. Wyatt shoved him away, shouting, "The fight has commenced. Go to fighting, or get away." Ike fled through the doors of Fly's boarding house, followed shortly by Billy Claiborne. In roughly 30 seconds, approximately 30 rounds were fired. When the smoke cleared, Frank and Tom McClory were dead. Billy Clanton lay dying in agonizing pain. Virgil Earp had been shot through the calf, and Morgan Earp had taken a bullet across both shoulder blades, narrowly missing his spine. Doc Holliday had been grazed on the hip. Only Wyatt Earp stood completely untouched. The Spicer hearing, justice in exoneration. The gunfight did not end the war. It merely moved it into the courtroom. The bodies of the cowboys were displayed in the window of a local hardware store under a sign reading "Murdered" in the streets of Tombstone. Their funeral was the largest the town had ever seen, a massive display of rural political power and a stark warning to the Earps. Sheriff Bean swiftly swore out motor warrants for the Earps and Holiday. The men were arrested, and the town braced for a lynching. What followed was a month-long preliminary hearing presided over by Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. The Spicer hearing was the most intensely scrutinized legal proceeding in the territory's history. The prosecution, backed by cowboy money and Sheriff Bean's testimony, painted the Earps as cold-blooded assassins who had gunned down surrendering men. The defense, led by the brilliant lawyer Thomas Fitch, argued that the Earps were legally appointed officers acting in self-defense against armed criminals resisting arrest. The turning point of the trial was the testimony of Ike Clanton. Driven by a desire for revenge, Ike took the stand, but he proved to be a disastrous witness for the prosecution. Under cross-examination, his story unraveled. He made absurd claims, including that the Earps had confessed to him about the stagecoach robberies, and he contradicted his own previous statements. His vindictiveness and obvious perjury destroyed the credibility of the cowboy narrative. On November 30th, 1881, Justice Spicer delivered his ruling. He acknowledged that Virgil Earp had acted recklessly by bringing his known enemies, Wyatt and Doc Holliday, to a volatile disarmament. However, Spicer ruled that the Earps were acting within their legal capacity as law officers facing armed resistance. He famously concluded that he could not attach criminality to an act that, if not performed, would have resulted in the officers' own deaths. The Earps and Holliday were completely exonerated and released. The Northern Republican establishment of Tombstone breathed a sigh of relief, believing the rule of law had prevailed. But the Cochise County Cowboys did not respect the rulings of town courts. Denied their legal vengeance, they turned to the only justice they recognized, the law of the feud. Blood and retribution, the Earp vendetta, ride justice. Wells Spicer's decision to exonerate the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday may have satisfied the northern pro-business establishment of Tombstone, but to the Cochise County Cowboys, it was a declaration of war. The syndicate recognized that they could not defeat the Earps in a courtroom controlled by Republican appointees, nor could they beat them in a face-to-face street fight. Consequently, the Cowboys abandoned any pretense of frontier chivalry. They resorted to the tactics of guerrilla warfare, ambush, assassination, and terror. What followed was a descent into a blood feud that would permanently shatter the Earp family and transform Wyatt Earp from a badge-wearing capitalist into an angel of vengeance. Midnight assassins, the crippling of Virgil Earp. The Cowboys did not wait long to enact their revenge. On the night of December 28, 1881, barely a month after the Spicer hearing concluded, Virgil Earp stepped out of the Oriental Saloon and began to cross 5th Street toward his hotel. It was a dark, freezing night. As you reached the middle of the intersection, a barrage of shotgun fire erupted from the darkness of a second-story building under construction across the street. The ambush was cowardly, calculated, and devastating. 3 loads of buckshot tore into Virgil. One blast shattered his left arm above the elbow, practically severing it, while another entered his back, narrowly missing his spine. Virgil survived the assassination attempt by sheer force of will, but his career as a frontline lawman was over. The town's chief of police and the most stabilizing force in the Earp faction had been permanently crippled. For the Earps, the message was unmistakable. The badge offered no protection. Wyatt Earp, recognizing that the local law enforcement apparatus under Sheriff Johnny Bean was utterly complicit in the Cowboys' campaign of terror, obtained a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal. He began assembling a federal posse, heavily armed and deeply loyal, operating under the guise of federal authority but driven entirely by personal retribution. The breaking point, the murder of Morgan Earp. The Cowboys struck their most fatal blow on the evening of March 18th, 1882. Morgan Earp, the youngest of the Tombstone Earps, and Wyatt's favorite brother, was playing a late-night game of billiards at Campbell and Hatch's saloon. The rear door of the saloon featured a glass window that looked out into a dark, narrow alley. As Morgan leaned over the table to line up a shot, an assassin fired a rifle through the glass. The heavy caliber bullet shattered Morgan's spine, passed cleanly through his body, and lodged in the thigh of a bystander. The second shot narrowly missed Wyatt, who was watching the game from a chair against the wall. Morgan collapsed to the floor. His brothers carried him to a nearby lounge, but the wound was catastrophic. Within an hour, Morgan Earp bled to death in Wyatt's arms. The assassination of Morgan Earp was a psychological breaking point for Wyatt. The cold, calculating gambler and political aspirant vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a singular, terrifying purpose. Wyatt realized that the civilizing forces he had fought for, the courts, the town ordinances, the rule of law, were completely useless against an entrenched syndicate willing to murder men in the dark. To destroy the Cochise County Cowboys, Wyatt Earp decided he had to become exactly like them. A killer, bound by no law but his own. The Tucson train station, a message in lead. Fearing for the safety of his remaining family, Wyatt arranged to send the crippled Virgil and his wife back to the safety of California on a train. Wyatt, Doc Holliday, and a heavily armed posse escorted them to the rail yard in Tucson on March 20th, 1882. Upon arriving at the station, Wyatt received word that Ike Clanton and Frank Stillwell, a known cowboy and former deputy of Sheriff Bien, highly suspected of pulling the trigger on Morgan, were lurking among the flat cars. Wyatt did not seek out the local Tucson authorities. Instead, he grabbed a shotgun and hunted Stillwell for the dark rail yard. When Stillwell saw Earp coming, he ran, but he was no match for a man fueled by absolute grief and rage. Wyatt ran Stillwell down on the tracks. In a brutal, intimate execution, Wyatt shoved the barrels of his shotgun directly into Stillwell's chest and pulled the trigger. The posse then riddled Stillwell's body with rifle fire, leaving his corpse on the tracks as a gruesome warning to the rest of the syndicate. Warrants were immediately issued for Wyatt Earp's arrest for the murder of Frank Stillwell. Wyatt was now a wanted man, operating a posse that was technically federal but functionally extrajudicial. The Earp vendetta ride had officially begun. The Vendetta Posse and the Battle of Iron Springs. Wyatt Earp's Vendetta Posse was a formidable unit. Alongside the fatally ill but unflinchingly loyal Doc Holliday, the posse included Wyatt's youngest brother, Warren Earp, and hardened frontiersmen like Sherman McMaster, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack. Vermilion. Over the next 2 weeks, this heavily armed death squad crisscrossed Cochise County, hunting down anyone involved in the attacks on Virgil and Morgan. The climax of the Vendetta ride occurred on March 24th, 1882, at a watering hole known as Iron Springs, later Mescal Springs, in the Whetstone Mountains. Wyatt's posse rode into a surprise ambush, stumbling directly into the camp of Curly Bill Brocius and nearly a dozen cowboys. A fierce firefight erupted instantly. As the rest of his posse retreated to find cover, Wyatt Earp boldly stood his ground in the open clearing, dismounted, and pulled his shotgun. In a legendary display of nerve, Wyatt waded through a hail of cowboy bullets, which miraculously only tore through the fabric of his long coat and shot off his boot heel, and fired a devastating blast into Curly Bill's chest, nearly cutting the cowboy warlord in half. He then drew his revolver and laid down covering fire, wounding Johnny Barnes and another cowboy before making a tactical retreat. The death of Curly Bill Brocius was the killing blow to the Cochise County Cowboys. With old Man Clanton dead, the McLaurys buried, and now their charismatic warlord killed by a seemingly invincible Wyatt Earp,
the psychological backbone of the syndicate snapped.
In early April 1882, knowing that remaining in Arizona would eventually lead to their arrest or death by a much larger cowboy militia, Wyatt Earp and his posse rode out of the territory, seeking sanctuary in Colorado. They left behind a trail of bodies, a crippled criminal syndicate, and a legacy of extrajudicial violence that would forever complicate the American understanding of law and order. Wyatt Earp had lost his brothers, his career, and his home, but he had systematically dismantled the most powerful outlaw empire in the West. The fall of the Cowboys, the end of an era. The Earp vendetta ride did not kill every member of the Cochise County Cowboys, but it successfully decapitated the organization. With old Man Clanton massacred in Mexico, the McClory brothers buried in Tombstone, and Curly Bill Brocius practically cut in half by Wyatt Earp's shotgun at Iron Springs, the syndicate's infrastructure collapsed. The loose confederation of rustlers, lacking charismatic leadership and the protective political shield that Sheriff BM could no longer guarantee, quickly fractured into disorganized, petty gangs. However, it was not merely the violence of the Earps that destroyed the Cowboys. It was the relentless, unstoppable march of modernity. The scattering and the solitary death of Johnny Ringo. In the months following Wyatt Earp's departure from the Arizona Territory in April 1882, the remaining high-profile Cowboys met grim, isolated ends. The most politic and debated of these deaths belonged to Johnny Ringo. Without the broader syndicate to anchor him, Ringo's severe alcoholism and chronic depression spiraled out of control. In July 1882, a local teamster discovered Ringo's body in a grove of oaks near West Turkey Creek in the Chiricahua Mountains. The melancholic killer was found seated against the trunk of a tree, a bullet hole in his right temple, and his Colt revolver still gripped in his hand. His boots had been removed, and strips of his undershirt were wrapped around his feet, suggesting his horse had wandered off, and he had walked until he could walk no more. While popular folklore and Hollywood have endlessly theorized that Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday secretly returned to Arizona to assassinate him, the historical consensus leans heavily toward suicide. Ringo's solitary, despairing end in the remote wilderness perfectly symbolized the death of the cowboy faction itself, isolated, exhausted, and self-destructive. Ike Clanton, the loudmouth instigator who had catalyzed the violence at the OK Corral and survived by fleeing, met a decidedly unheroic end. He moved his rustling operations north into Apache County, believing he had escaped the reach of the law. However, the territory was changing. In 1887, a local lawman and detective named Jonas V. Brighton tracked Ike down to a ranch. When Clanton attempted to draw his rifle and flee, Brighton shot him dead, ending the Clanton family's criminal legacy with a whimper rather than a war. The encroachment of modernity. While the Earp posse inflicted the fatal wounds, the changing economic and political landscape of the American West buried the Cochise County Cowboys. By the mid-1980s, the environment that had allowed the syndicate to thrive was rapidly disappearing. The expansion of the Southern Pacific Railroad fundamentally altered the cattle industry. It allowed massive, heavily capitalized corporate cattle conglomerates from the East Coast and Great Britain to move into the Arizona Territory. These corporate ranchers had the financial and political leverage to demand strict, uncompromising law enforcement. They successfully lobbied the territorial government to crack down on rustling, transforming it from a socially tolerated nuisance into a heavily prosecuted felony. Furthermore, the arrival of the railroad brought an influx of new settlers, families, and civic-minded institutions that fundamentally diluted the rural, outlaw-sympathizing voting bloc. The days when a corrupt sheriff like Johnny Behen could maintain power through the votes of rustlers were over. Perhaps the most devastating blow to the cowboy way of life was the invention and mass production of barbed wire. The Cochise County Cowboys had relied entirely on the concept of the open range. which allowed them to move stolen herds across vast distances without restriction. As corporate ranches began stringing thousands of miles of barbed wire across the Southwest, the landscape was physically carved up. The old smuggling routes through the valleys and canyons were choked off. By the dawn of the 1890s, the term cowboy was undergoing a massive cultural shift. It was being scrubbed of its association with red-sashed organized crime and rebranded by Wild West shows and dime novelists as a symbol of honest, hard-working American exceptionalism. The Cochise County Cowboys were not just defeated by rival gunmen. They were legislated, industrialized, and fenced out of existence. The frontier had closed, and the empire of dust and lead had crumbled into history. Legacy and myth-making, a celluloid syndicate, the final demise of the Cochise County Cowboys in the late 1880s did not mark the end of their story. Rather, it marked their transition from history into mythology. The conflict in Tombstone contained all the necessary ingredients for a compelling American epic: righteous lawmen, dangerous outlaws, political corruption, and bloody gunfights. However, as the decades passed, the complex political and economic realities of the Cowboy Syndicate were systematically stripped away. They were flattened by dime novelists, biographers, and Hollywood directors into one-dimensional villains, serving merely as dark foils to highlight the shining tin stars of the Earp brothers. Gimme Not the myth-making began almost immediately after the smoke cleared at the OK Corral. Late 19th century America had a voracious appetite for tales of the Wild West, fueled by sensationalist dime novels and the romanticized reporting of the era. The narrative surrounding the Tombstone conflict was largely dictated by the victors. White Earp survived, and with the help of friendly journalists and writers, he spent his later years carefully curating his legacy. The most consequential text in this mythologization was Stuart Inn's Common Pastor, Lake's 1931 biography, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. Published 2 years after Wyatt's death, Lake's book was a massive commercial success that fundamentally altered the American public's perception of the frontier. Lake elevated Earp to the status of an incorruptible, almost messianic lawman. In doing so, he necessarily reduced the Cochise County Cowboys to a monolithic, inherently evil gang of cutthroats. The nuanced reality of the Cowboys as a powerful agrarian political faction with deep ties to the local Democratic Party and the county sheriff was replaced by a simplistic tale of good versus evil. Hollywood's blank canvas. If Stuart Lake drew the blueprint for the Tombstone myth, Hollywood built the cathedral. For much of the 20th century, westerns dominated the silver screen, and the gunfight at the OK Corral became the genre's defining set piece. In classic films like John Ford's My Darling Clementine, 1946, and John Sturgis's Gunfight at the OK Corral, 1957, the cowboys were heavily fictionalized to suit the moral absolute of the mid-century Western. Old Man Clanton was often portrayed as a tyrannical, whip-cracking villain, while Doc Holliday was softened into a tragic hero. The cowboys in these films rarely possessed the sophisticated rustling infrastructure or the political alliances that made the historical syndicate so formidable. They were simply bad men who needed to be shot by good men. It was not until the late 20th century that pop culture began to reintroduce the stylistic and chaotic elements of the real cowboy faction. The 1993 film Tombstone brought the syndicate back to the forefront of the public imagination. While still highly dramatized, the film accurately depicted the cowboys wearing their signature red sashes, operating as a massive, loosely affiliated gang, and wielding genuine political power through Sheriff BM. It highlighted the sheer terror instilled by figures like Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo, capturing the volatile, heavily armed reality of Cochise County. The modern historical reassessment today, modern historians view the Cochise County Cowboys through a much more objective, sociological lens. The good guys versus bad guys. Narrative has been replaced by an understanding of political economy and frontier sociology. Historians now recognize that the conflict between the Earps and the Cowboys was an inevitable proxy war between two incompatible visions of America. The Cowboys represent the dying breath of the Jacksonian frontier, a place defined by agrarian independence, fluid borders, and a deep distrust of centralized authority. They were outlaws, certainly, but their outlawry was subsidized by a local population that viewed Eastern mining corporations and federal lawmen with profound suspicion. Conversely, the Earp faction is now understood not as altruistic white knights, but as the vanguard of industrial capitalism. They were the muscle brought in by the Republican establishment to enforce the rules necessary for corporate investment to thrive. When the Earps shot the McClorys and Billy Clanton, they were not just enforcing city ordinances. They were executing the frontier's eviction notice. The Cochise County Cowboys endure in our cultural memory precisely because they represent a paradox. We condemn their violence, their thievery, and their ruthless intimidation. Yet the American psyche harbors a lingering romantic fascination with the untamed rebel. The Cowboys, with their red sashes and their defiance of the encroaching modern world, remain the ultimate symbol of the West before it was fenced, legislated, and paved over. Conclusion: the epitaph of the frontier. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted roughly 30 seconds, but the echoes of that violence have resonated for over a century. When we peel back the layers of Hollywood mythology, dime store pulp, and deeply entrenched folklore, the true story of the Cochise County Cowboys emerges not as a simple tale of black hats and white knights, but as a complex, bloody proxy war for the soul of the American West. As the evidence demonstrates, the Cowboys were far more than a disorganized gang of stagecoach robbers. They were a sophisticated, agrarian-based syndicate that levers the geographic vulnerabilities of the U.S.-Mexico border to build a highly lucrative black market economy. Bound by a loose confederation, a shared Southern heritage, and their signature red sashes, figures like Old Man Clanton, Curly Bill Brocius, and Johnny Ringo commanded immense regional power. They survived as long as they did because they were deeply integrated into the local political infrastructure, protected by a symbiotic relationship with Sheriff Johnny Behan and the rural Democratic electorate. However, their empire of dust and lead was inherently unsustainable. The conflict in Tombstone was the violent collision of two irreconcilable eras. The Cochise County Cowboys represented the old Jacksonian frontier, a sprawling, unfenced world defined by violent independence, opportunism, and a fierce rejection of centralized authority. Their antagonists, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday, represented the relentless, encroaching forces of modern industrialism. Backed by Northern Republican interests and Eastern mining capital, the Earps were the uncompromising enforcers of a new corporate reality that demanded stability, infrastructure, and the strict rule of law. Ultimately, the Cowboys were not defeated merely by the shotguns and revolvers of the Earp Vendetta ride. Wyatt Earp's extrajudicial posse may have dismantled the syndicate's leadership, but it was the quiet, unstoppable machinery of progress that truly eradicated them. The expansion of the railroad, the influx of corporate cattle conglomerates, and the mass production of barbed wire carved up the open range, physically and economically fencing the outlaws out of existence. The world that had allowed the Cowboys to thrive simply ceased to be. Today, the Cochise County Cowboys occupy a paradoxical space in the American consciousness. Historically, they were a dangerous, often brutal criminal enterprise that terrorized the borderlands and actively fought against the civilizing of the Arizona Territory. Yet culturally, they endure as enduring symbols of defiance. In the dust of Skeleton Canyon and the blood-stained lot behind the OK Corral, we see the tragic, inevitable friction of a nation rapidly transforming itself. The Cochise County Cowboys were not the heroes of the frontier, but they were undeniably its last, violent, and unforgettable gasp. That will wrap it up today. Please join us again for the Earp Brothers.